Hi, everyone. I want to begin with my own land acknowledgement. So I want to acknowledge I'm delivering this presentation on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. As a historian, I study the past, including the histories of colonization and imperialism that have brought me to this land. But I acknowledge that colonialism is an ongoing process, not something confined to the past. I also stand with the people of Iran, young girls, students, and Iranians from diverse ethnic communities who are protesting for their freedom. While Iranians are protesting for their right to choose to live freely today, the protests are also informed by past events in the country. And my talk today addresses the history of American imperialism in Iran and provides some context for considering US-Iran relations leading up to the 1979 revolution. This is a photo that I found on eBay as I was happened to be searching one day. And it shows an image of a nurse. And on the back of the photo, it indicates that this person, Helen Jacobs, was the young daughter of an aristocratic Persian family, a famous physician. She was likely Jewish. Traveled 6,000 miles from Tabriz, Persia, to the Cook County Hospital in Chicago, where she undertook schooling. It also indicates her mother was a physician. I tried to find out about the genealogy of the photo, but the seller had no idea. But this photo kind of symbolizes what I'm trying to argue today. My argument is twofold. First, I argue that an American model of nursing education, which is why I used FLO without FLO in my title as abbreviation for Nightingale, was initiated by missionary nurses in Iran, and that this was the sole path of formal nursing education in the country until the 1930s, and then less directly until World War II. And it provided opportunities for some Iranian nurses to achieve mobility within Iranian healthcare and civil society. And then secondly, it also facilitated a flow of Iranian nurses to the US for education or for permanent relocation.
What was the time period of that picture? Did you have it?
I don't think it said, no. And I haven't been able to find out. I've searched for any records of this individual, but haven't found anything yet. Tabriz, where that individual, Helen Jacobs, grew up, was the site of American Presbyterian missionaries' initial efforts in Iran in the mid-19th century. The mission was established in 1834, and it was the only American missionary presence in the country and the dominant way that US-Iran relations were understood in the early 20th century. And in fact, it was a result of the mission that the US established formal diplomatic relations with Iran in 1883. So Helen Jacobs would have known about the American mission in Tabriz and possibly or probably attended American missionary schools. In the late 19th century, medical work became a dominant feature of the mission. It came to operate 7 hospitals, one in each of the mission stations, and they're indicated with the red. They're kind of hard to see, but the red dots, mostly in northern Iran, and then also Mashhad on the right. There was also a nursing school started at each of these locations. Mission surgeons initially felt that they couldn't perform complex operations without trained nurses, so they had lobbied the Board of Foreign Missions in New York to assign trained nurses to Iran, American nurses to Iran, arguing that a hospital without a nurse is no hospital. And these are just some images of some of the hospitals that were established. The number of patients who crossed paths with American hospitals in Iran was extensive. And I have this quote in my records of a young girl who was treated in one of the hospitals, and she thought that she was actually going to the US every time she went to the mission hospital in Iran. So these hospitals functioned as a conduit between the US and Iran, as this quote kind of also indicates. Between 1907 and 1947, 23 American nurses worked as Presbyterian missionaries in Iran. They pursued mission work for diverse reasons beyond a religious calling. For example, mission nurse Eunice Baber wrote in her application for missionary service that she had little interest in evangelism, but she was keen to use mission work to fulfill her life work purpose to nurse in places where the need is great and facilities few. She endorsed a professionalizing agenda rather than an evangelizing one when she stated, "I am not a born missionary, but I am a fanatic about nursing." Once they arrived in Iran, American mission nurses consistently pursued measures aimed at promoting nursing as a profession. Their goal was to produce fine nurses for Iran, that's a quote, and their main effort to achieve this was by opening nursing schools and training students. For 20 years, between 1916 and 1936, they operated the only nursing schools in the country, one in each mission station, and they used these schools to police the social body of the nascent profession. So in effect, what I argue more broadly is that they proselytized for the nursing profession. Mission nursing was a project of American imperialism under the guise of benevolent reform. American nurses participated in this civilizing mission and understood their role as missionaries within that framework. While some nurses, especially those who were born in Iran to missionary parents, questioned and even criticized the evangelistic thrust of mission work, they presumed that their nursing work was important and necessary for the uplift of Iranian women and Iranian healthcare. After watching a class of student nurses graduate in 1923, one missionary nurse wrote that when she let her imagination play, she could envision a time when the present tiny nucleus of trained nurses in Persia will become a mighty army going up and down the length and breadth of the land, fighting for the health of this poor degenerated people, unquote. In this nurse's view, Iranian nurses, equipped with an American-based nursing education, were the means of regenerating this unhealthy Iranian nation. American nurses also worked to construct a strong, unified professional nursing identity that would bridge divisions among students and connect them to a much broader international ethos of professional nursing. Students who attended the schools came from various ethnic, linguistic, class, religious backgrounds. So American nurses tried to use these American-style nursing traditions to foster a common professional identity. And this included things like capping and graduation ceremonies. The capping ceremony held at the hospital in Mashhad in 1942 demonstrated how missionary nurses used this event to kind of instill loyalty in their students. During the ceremony, the student nurses performed this elaborate play that chronicled the history of nursing. It was based on a popular nursing textbook that was used widely in the US at the time. And student nurse actors made appearances on stage dressed as these various characters and heroes of nursing past. So you can see there's like a Roman matron, a Sister of Charity, a Nightingale, a Red Cross nurse, a public health nurse, a mother and baby off to the right. Missionary nurses also embraced Nightingale as a symbol of duty to nation and used her to instill ideas about service in the students. Commenting on events of one capping ceremony, missionary nurse Frances Whitting wrote, the 4 students lit their candles from Florence Nightingale's lamp, the light of service, and repeated together in Persian the pledge named for her. Iranian nurses who graduated from mission nursing schools were the first trained nurses in the country, and some took on the professionalizing agenda endorsed by missionaries. Professional nursing presented Iranian women with opportunities for financial, social, geographical, and professional mobility at a time when there were not a lot of opportunities open to women. In her review of the women's journal Alam-i Nesfan, historian Jasmine Rastam Koulayi found that the only professional working women who appeared in the journal before 1931 were teachers. This changed in 1932 with a new section called Women's Occupations. It was introduced, and it also discussed professions such as nursing. When Reza Shah came to power, he undertook social, economic, and political reforms intended to modernize the nation, and these modernization initiatives led to an expansion in private and public hospitals. So there was opportunities for trained nurses, and they were in high demand. And mission-trained nurses worked in private labs, private hospitals, city hospitals, mission hospitals, private duty nursing. They often had multiple job offers and could be selective about the type of work that they wanted to do. For example, 2 nurses who graduated from the mission school in Tabriz in 1934 turned down an opportunity to work for the government in the military department because they did not find the offer attractive. They chose instead to go into private duty nursing. Some women likely pursued nursing work because it offered them economic security, and in particular, the graduates who went to work for the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company were paid like 3 times the salary of nurses that would have been paid at other like city or mission hospitals, and they were also given food allowances. The working conditions were also really good. It was air conditioned, and so on. And it made the work more enjoyable. This work was attractive because of the financial and material remuneration that they received. Although missionaries couldn't offer such competitive wages, some graduate nurses may have found employment in mission hospitals attractive for other reasons. The most promising students were assigned to supervisory positions within the hospitals. They became head nurses on the wards, were in charge of the operating room, taught in the nursing schools, became nurse anesthetists. Graduate nurses were also highly mobile and moved between different mission hospitals, and what the records kind of show is that nurses were drawn from the provinces to work in the city of Tehran. So nursing work facilitated this rural to city migration. Several graduates became educators, and they taught in the government nursing schools. One became the director of nursing at a hospital in Shiraz. One took a midwifery course at the University of Beirut, and then became the obstetrician-in-chief at the city hospital in Tabriz. Others occupied important positions as chief directors of nursing of various provinces. American model nursing education was also a path toward emigration. This was particularly important for Assyrian Christians who occupied a precarious position in Iran after the First World War, when an estimated 2/3 of Assyrians were killed. Grace Syed was an Assyrian nurse who graduated from the Mission Nursing School in Urumia in 1930. She worked in a mission hospital for several years after she graduated, and then she got married. Both Grace and her husband William had lost family members during the First World War, and this tragedy, from the moment it happened, motivated them to leave Iran, but it took them many years before they were able to do so. They made the strategic decision to send Grace to the US in 1957. She was sponsored by her stepmother and half-sister, who were already in the US, and she quickly found work as a nurse's aide at Augustana Hospital in Chicago. Within the first, I think it was 6 months, she saved $8,000, and this stable income and the funds she'd acquired enabled her to sponsor William and Sonia, her daughter, to come to the US. 2 weeks after they arrived in the US, her family, Grace quit her job at the hospital and the family moved to California. It was her training and experience in the Mission Nursing School that had enabled her to find work in the US, and she was fluent in English also, which had enabled her to get the job. The family's migration across national borders hinged on Grace's ability to find work in the US as a nursing aide. Another Assyrian nurse who graduated with Grace, I'm just giving these two examples, is Anna Lakin, who also immigrated to the US. After she graduated from the Mission Nursing School in Urumia, she went to work at other mission hospitals before moving on to leadership positions outside of the mission system. She became an assistant superintendent and instructor of the government nursing school in Tehran, and she became a director of nursing at Meir Hospital in Tehran before she became a superintendent of the Children's Hospital in Tehran, and then she also started a small nursing school there. She immigrated to the US in 1949 and tried to use her connections with the mission to advance her nursing career. She was writing to members of the board and former missionaries, seeing if they could help her. She had really wanted to attend the School of Nurse Midwifery at the Maternity Center Association of New York, and even before she left Iran, some of the missionaries had written letters for her, and it was full. She was not able to get in at that time. 4 months after she arrived in the US, she was living with a cousin in Chicago, and she wrote to a missionary physician, and she said, "I know nobody here to go with or be introduced to. As I see here, is just as in Iran, everything is in friendship. Those who have friends, they can get positions, others not. So I'm at home all day doing nothing." There's no further correspondence in the archive, but I did do some research and found the Quality Bulletin of Frontier Nursing indicated that she joined as a student in 1950 for this midwifery program. And then she was issued her registered professional nurse license in 1954. Iranian women also used the nursing profession to enter civil society. In 1939, nurses who graduated from mission nursing schools formed an alumni association where they met to discuss problems confronting the new profession. In 1939, 14 of them met together in Tehran, from Tehran to Tabriz and Mashhad. They came together and formed the Nurses Association of Tehran, and then later on it became the Iranian Nurses Association. And in 1957, it became a member of the International Council of Nurses. Some Iranian nurses enhanced their professional goals through international education. So again, they're flowing to the US for education, or this is the way I'm thinking about it. So one graduate of a mission nursing school in Tabriz, Azar Riahi, went on to obtain a degree from Columbia University. And on her return to Iran, she became an educational consultant for the Minister of Health. And likewise, the chief nurse of the Department of Public Health in Iran, Fatemeh Sassali, obtained a degree from Teachers College at Columbia in the 1950s. And in her application to the Rockefeller Foundation for a grant to carry out this period of study, she wrote, "In all our 12 nursing schools in Iran, we do not have one single Iranian nurse with a degree. Therefore, my country needs special attention in the nursing field, and we cannot accomplish what we need in nursing unless the young qualified nurses become interested in advanced education. And this can be accomplished through the understanding of nursing education in the free world." So kind of what I argue more broadly is that some of these nurses who took on this, they took on a professionalizing agenda very similar to American nurses had. And I wanted to show, I think, I put this quote here. It's a little bit outside the flow framework, but I really have come to appreciate this quote recently, where she says, "I believe a nurse is not only a member of a health team, but also a member of society. Therefore, the college education will enable a nurse as a citizen to appreciate and participate in the society and community with a much broader understanding." And she also went on to coin this term about the nurse citizen. And these are my last slides to kind of show you that by the time mission nurses exited Iran in 1979, Iranian nurses were at the forefront of the national agenda, but they were also extremely active as citizens. So you can see they're dressed as nurses in their nursing identity and marching in this parade for International Women's Day. And then again in March 1979, after the revolution, they protested mandatory hijab. And you can see that this is a nurse who gives this quote, but the nurses were out protesting at a hospital opposed to mandatory hijab. And that's my end. So thank you very much for listening.
Okay, so I guess in the first talk, we talked about the flow of people. And so in my talk, we're going to talk a little bit more about the flow of technology. And something that I think is really cool about actually the three of us coming together is this was by no means intentional, but I think the actual flow of our presentations flows quite well. Just even between like the really variety of interdisciplinary between the three of us. So this was our question. So how does the global flow of ideas, knowledge, and technology shape our research projects in relation to our disciplinary background? So I thought I would start off by talking about my disciplinary background. So I was trained actually as an undergrad in chemical engineering, and my PhD was also in bioengineering. But I then kind of took a left turn for my postdoctoral training and did a postdoc fellowship in an immunology lab. So this is a very bizarre place for an engineer to go because I was surrounded by 30 immunologists and the only engineer, and I realized we spoke completely different languages. So I spent about the first year of my training just learning how to talk to immunologists about surface markers and cell types. But this is really, I think, has benefited me now with what I do because so much of what we do as engineers, and especially biomedical engineers, interfaces with the immune system. So I think really a strong understanding of that science is actually imperative, especially for what I do with RNA vaccines and therapies. So I'm going to start off by talking about COVID-19 and kind of my experience with RNA vaccines during the pandemic, but then also move on to where do we go from here? So we've seen, the development of these RNA vaccines, but what else can it be used for, and how does this kind of flow between all the countries that are actually involved in the creation of these amazing technologies? So just to start off, for those of you who aren't familiar about how you make an RNA vaccine against a brand new pathogen, this is really the beauty of this platform, is that even with a brand new pathogen like SARS-CoV-2, where we don't know much about it, it's really easy to make a new RNA vaccine. So the first step is to take this protein on the surface of the virus, and we take the code for that protein and encode it in the RNA. So this is a very fancy term, so we use the prefusion stabilized spike antigen. It's just the code that we actually put into our RNA. And to actually physically do this, practically what you do is you type the sequence into software, you order it, and then it comes in a few days. So it's pretty, it sounds a lot fancier, but it's actually a very it's simple. It's almost like Amazon for vaccines. So we then take that RNA and we encapsulate it in these particles. RNA is a really large negatively charged molecule, as are your cell membranes, so it's not going to get taken up spontaneously. So you may have heard about these fat bubbles or lipid nanoparticles, and that technology was actually developed primarily here at UBC by Peter Cullis. So he has a long legacy of those formulations, which is, it's really awesome to be at the same institution. So you then take these formulations and you inject it intramuscularly and test whether your vaccine works or not. So one of the most profound changes about RNA vaccines versus traditional types of vaccines is actually the timeline of making these. So while I was a postdoc, we were actually planning on doing a clinical trial for our RNA vaccine that we had been working on. But instead of doing it for Marburg and rabies viruses as we had initially intended, we pivoted and did it for COVID-19 instead. So I wanted to walk you through the timeline of how long that took and kind of what are the bottlenecks for testing. So sorry, I don't know where the feedback is coming from. So the circulating strain was originally sequenced and published, so it was made publicly available on the 10th of January. Our team at Imperial College accessed it on the 20th of January. We ordered our DNA like I was talking about, so we typed our DNA code into the software and ordered it on the 22nd of January. We then assembled our plasmid, which is one of the precursors for making RNA, on the 28th of January. We then confirmed that we were getting the right antigen expression from our RNA vaccine on the 12th of February. We started our in vivo studies in mice on the 13th of February, so the next day. We then had to do a rat toxicology study before we started our human clinical trials, so we started that on the 30th of March. We published our preclinical paper on this on the 22nd of April, and then we started our clinical trials on the 19th of June. So even as a small academic team, we were able to go from designing this brand new RNA vaccine against a pathogen that had just been sequenced to testing it in clinical trials within a 6-month period. So that's really the beauty of these RNA vaccines, and we did this in about 6 months, but Moderna reportedly did it in just 66 days, and I bet you that that has actually gotten even faster since the pandemic. So this is really one of the values of these technologies, is just not that you can scale it up for billions of people, but also it's a much faster turnaround time for making RNA vaccines. So that gets us to the next step. How do you, when you have to vaccinate billions of people, how do you actually do that? And why are RNA vaccines such an advantage? So I'll walk you through how we did this historically and why RNA is such an advantage. So this is a picture of how we made flu vaccines in 1957. So they were made in eggs. You inject them, each one manually, and then purify out the virus and put that into the flu vaccine. And that's how we're still doing it today. So this is a super archaic technology, but for those of you, it's flu vaccine season. And so for anybody who's gotten a flu vaccine recently, the main way we still do it is still in eggs. And as you can imagine, this is a highly manual and time and resource intensive process. And so it just, so one of the ways that this impacts us is that we have to decide the strains that we're going to put into that vaccine in February of each year so that they're ready for distribution in October. But as we know, with flu and COVID, it's changed a lot in that time. And so there's a big lag between when we decided those strains and when you actually get the vaccine. So for other vaccines, flu is probably the most archaic one that we still use regularly, but other vaccines like protein and viral vectors like the AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson vaccines, we have to make in these huge bioreactors. And so they take a long time because you have to grow up a batch of cells, you have to wait till it makes enough protein or virus, and then you purify it out. And you have to optimize this process for every single vaccine that you're making, and that alone can take years of optimization. So on the contrary, RNA vaccines are a completely synthetic process. So it doesn't require cells, it doesn't require eggs. We just dump a bunch of ingredients into a beaker. And what's really amazing is the volume and the scale of this. So in just a volume of 100 milliliters, you're able to make 1 million doses of an RNA vaccine. So this is quite a powerful technology, and I think really goes to show you this is why billions of people have received RNA vaccines now. So just to put that into perspective, I like to think about this, in the context of actually vaccinating the world. So I think it's interesting to ask this question, which is how many Olympic-sized swimming pools did it take to actually vaccinate the world with an RNA vaccine? So I made these calculations for the original Pfizer and BioNTech vaccine. So assuming that there's 7.7 billion people in the world, and initially everybody needed 2 doses of the vaccine, that's 15.4 billion doses total. Each dose is a volume of 0.3 milliliters. So the total required volume is 4.62 million liters. Each Olympic-sized swimming pool holds about 2.5 million liters. So that means that you just need 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools to vaccinate the entire world. So this is no doubt a large volume of liquid, but it's a very feasible volume of liquid, right? So it's actually possible, and why we've seen that now billions of people have gotten these vaccines. So how is this going to impact us in the future, right? So we have our RNA, we can easily make it into this new formulation, we put it into vials, and then we can manufacture it seemingly all over the world. So this is really, I think, a technology. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Pinky and the Brain, but I think that's kind of the attitude of RNA vaccines right now. It's just like, what are we going to do today, Pinky, and take over the world? And it kind of feels like in the media that's how it's been in the last 2 years or so. So just to put you into context, I think this is where it comes into this flow of borders, and really there have been a few, companies that have really been highlighted in the development of these vaccines, but I cannot stress enough how much of an incredibly interdisciplinary and collaborative effort it's been. So just to tell you anecdotally, when we were making our vaccine, which was based in the UK, we did our clinical trial there, we got the RNA from California. We got the lipids actually from Acuitas here in Vancouver. They were shipped to Austria to be formulated into the nanoparticles together. Those were then shipped to Italy to be put into the vials, and then those vials were shipped back to the UK to start the clinical trial. So even though we're doing this, it was designed in the UK, we relied on all these international partnerships to actually make it. And this is still very much true today. So as we're looking forward, like I said, the beauty of RNA vaccines is that it doesn't require this huge footprint. Like, you don't need these centralized manufacturing centers anymore, just based off of the sheer volume you can make. And so I think in the future, what we're going to start to see is having these centers all over the world. So you could imagine that as we're needing, a bivalent booster, or if we get an RNA vaccine that's approved for flu, they could be making these and distributing these locally and also responding to any changes in the virus. But you can also use RNA for a wide range of things beyond just vaccines against a virus. So actually what BioNTech was doing before the pandemic, they had an infectious disease arm, but they were mainly focused on cancer vaccines. And so you could imagine at this same manufacturing center, you could have a way to actually make personalized cancer vaccines for people in addition to your flu and COVID vaccines as needed. It's all on the same technology, and so it's really easy to just modularly switch between these vaccines. So this is a map of it's a little hard to see up there, but of the current manufacturing sites that we have. So most of these are based in the US and in Europe. That's really primarily because the companies that are able to do this right now. So obviously Pfizer is based mainly in the US, and BioNTech was based in Germany, so they have some centers around there, as well as Moderna is primarily based in the US, although now they're building a site in Canada as well. But you can see from this map, there's there's very few sites in the world that right now are able to do each of these different steps. So this was really because prior to the pandemic, obviously there wasn't an approved RNA vaccine, and so we just hadn't gotten to the point where we needed to scale this up and have many centers all over the world to do this. But I think this is going to change. So you can even see from this all the planned and announced manufacturing sites. So you can see that there's actually 2 here in Canada. So Precision Nanosystems, which is a local company here in Vancouver, they're building a site that should be open in summer of next year. And then Moderna is building one, I think, outside Montreal, as well as a number all over the world. So this technology is really starting to take off, which is really awesome to see because, there was a lot of imbalance, I think, in the beginning of the pandemic, and even still now that we're seeing as just to who has access to these vaccines, right? So even now, the most kind of up-to-date bivalent booster is only available in the US, and other countries have an updated bivalent, but it's different to the one in the US. And so having access to be able to make your own vaccine is hugely empowering because it means you don't have to wait on another country to get down their list and decide to send you enough doses for your population. So one of the things, and this transitions, I think, really nicely to what Matias is going to talk about, is just thinking about the intellectual property around these, because that's actually the main thing, right? I've said it's not that hard to make them. We're learning how to do this. We're building more and more manufacturing centers around the world. But during the pandemic, this IP is held by only a few companies, and so they're very protective about that, I think because everybody, at the company level sees the dollar signs of being able to make these vaccines. So it was really interesting to observe during the pandemic, and Matias will go much more into this, but there were some really surprising people that were actually supportive of sharing the IP of these vaccines, as well as the know-how how to make it. But I think what we actually saw that manifested from that was pretty much quite limited. So just to show you kind of the impact that I think this is going to have and all the potential applications, this is just publicly available information from BioNTech's website, but it shows you today, tomorrow, and the future of RNA technology. So today they have this approved RNA vaccines. Tomorrow, so things that are in the pipeline and pretty close to they're either being used clinically and have some chance of being approved as drugs. So using mRNA for infectious disease vaccines, as well as cancer vaccines, CAR T cells, so being able to use this for cell therapies, as well as using RNA to encode different proteins that can be used as immunotherapies. And in the future, there's many applications that people are really just starting to explore and understand the applications of, such as autoimmune diseases, allergy, inflammation, regenerative medicine, and many other therapeutic areas, especially for rare genetic disorders as well. So I think the impact is really huge of this, and I think that's why it's really important to think about how these ideas and technologies flow from country to country, company to company, because it's really going to make an impact on the way that we make medicine in the future. So with that, I'll hand it over to Matias.
Thank you, Anna. And thanks also, Anna, for putting all the slides together and somehow keeping all the formats together, which is a trick I don't know how to do, so I'm going to ask you later. So good afternoon, everyone. So I think my presentation flows very well from Anna's, because there was something we had in common. So on the one hand, her presentation really gets us excited about the potential of technology, right? Because this COVID experience taught us that, remind us that diseases can travel across borders very, very quickly, but also through cooperation and sharing of innovation and science, we can globally come up with solutions. However, one of the things we've also seen during the COVID-19 pandemic has been a big non-flow of vaccines around the world. So if we look at the latest, vaccinations worldwide, on average around the world, it's 62% of people have been vaccinated. If you go to rich countries, it's about 90. If you go to the poorest countries in the world, it's about 13 or 14%. So I'm an international political economist, and basically the question that we always ask is who wins, who loses, who benefits, qui bono. And so when I started to think about, COVID and the sort of disputes that have been happening around intellectual property rights. I thought this was a really great way to use my own expertise on international trade and bring it to this whole thinking about health and flows. Because in some ways it was actually very puzzling to me as somebody who's studied international trade and also familiar with earlier global public health crises, that we actually had to have this prolonged debate about intellectual property rights, and I'll explain why this was somewhat surprising. So the pandemic has not been the first time we've had a global pandemic, but in this particular case, what we saw during COVID was we had significant and very highly unequal access to medical goods, personal protective equipment, PPE, a term we all know now. For me, PPE was always politics, philosophy, and economics, which was the program I used to supervise when I worked in the UK. But we all became familiar with PPE. And we saw this unequal access, largely on one hand due to global supply chain disruptions. That just meant production of goods could not happen as normal, but also because we saw hoarding. We saw countries hoard masks. We saw countries hoard medicines. We saw countries hoard oxygen. And later and still continue to see countries hoard vaccines. So in the context of the WTO, the way the debate played at the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization, which is the global body which sets rules for international trade, is that very quickly the COVID debate around access to medical goods and PPE and later vaccines once they were developed was seen as an intellectual property rights problem. And this has a long history at the World Trade Organization. So in the late 90s and early 2000s, when the HIV/AIDS pandemic exploded around the world, very quickly there was this push by a lot of governments to say, we're going to suspend intellectual property rights and on drugs that fight retroviral drugs that fight HIV/AIDS. In this particular case, we recognize that balance between intellectual property rights and protecting, innovation, sometimes for the public good requires us to waive the property rights of those rights holders for the public benefit. And so there was this huge global campaign around this. Several countries such as South Africa, India, and Brazil had already started to waive intellectual property rights. And then later the international community agreed at the WTO that in the context of public health crises, it just made sense to waive patents to ensure that drugs and the technologies to produce them got out and circulated the globe as widely as possible to sort of contain these pandemics. So kind of establish an international precedent that in global health crises, that it was acceptable to deviate from intellectual property rights rules and to not respect the rights of intellectual property rights holders, which, as Anna was saying, typically tends to be a very small set of companies and very, very few countries. So there's a lot of concentration, tends to be in rich countries where most of the intellectual property rights owners operate and are held. Now, what we saw very quickly at the WTO was a debate around whether the existing rules of the WTO around public health and suspending intellectual property rights were sufficiently flexible given the unique properties and dynamics of the COVID pandemic. And in particular, most developing countries or southern states, as I'm using here, they were very clear in their perception and argument that they believed that the WTO rules, the Agreement on Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights, known as TRIPS, they really argued that this was holding up access to medicines, to PPE, their ability to produce it. And so they were really concerned about being left behind, essentially. They knew rich countries were going to get the drugs first, and they wanted to make sure they could get that as quickly as possible, so waiving patents made sense for them. Then other developments started to happen, which really started to amplify or increase the fear of developing countries. So we saw in one case, there was a company that had come up with a very, very affordable low-cost testing kit in the time when testing kits were really in high demand and very difficult to obtain. And what happened was there was a patent vulture firm. If you've never heard of patent vultures, they're companies that go out and buy patents. with the hope that one of those patents will become valuable. And it happened to be that one of the patents on one of the aspects of this testing kit had been bought up by a patent voucher firm, and so the company that was all excited about releasing this low-cost testing kit that could be distributed all around the world got threatened there would be a lawsuit coming. So that low-cost test kit never happened. We also saw it in the case of ventilator valves. So we remember in the early months of the pandemic, lots of concerns about oxygen, not enough oxygen, and also one of the things that was missing was these little tiny plastic valves that go into ventilators that were in short supply. So these used to go for about 100 euros on the market, about $100. By the time of the pandemic, they were going for about 10,000. So two very clever guys in Italy figured out how to reverse engineer them and then 3D print them. And they were very excited because and when people heard about this, hospitals all around the world said, great, we can get over this supply chain problem that we're having with ventilator valves, which are really important for people who are on ICU with very, very ill with COVID. And what happened? The owner of the intellectual property right for that valve said, we'll sue you if you distribute this. So we saw, again, these concerns about intellectual property rights were not just academic, but they were really happening in the real world. And development countries were increasingly concerned that also with all the sort of fast tracking programs that emerged in countries trying to produce vaccines quickly. So remember, US had warp speed. Other countries had similar programs. And what this did was sort of allow patents to be provided more quickly with sort of less robustness and less less hoops, let's say, than historically were available. So there was a concern that there would be also patent stacking or buildups in developed countries, and these would also become inaccessible as new innovations came out. So what developing countries demanded at the WTO was what we call a waiver, a legal waiver. And it just basically, it's also known as a peace clause, and it's a decision that states make at the WTO that just say, we will waive the property rights requirements on all of these goods. And in particular, they asked for a waiver that would apply to basically anything and everything related to PPE, medical goods, and future vaccines. So this was actually a very broad demand because when the sort of controversies happened around HIV and AIDS, the focus was only on retroviral drugs, but here it was on not just the drugs themselves, but also how to produce them. So getting at some of that production technology as well. Now, very quickly off the bat, we saw the usual suspects say, no way, we will not go for this. This was the US, the European Union, Switzerland, Canada, and Japan, working in concert with Big Pharma, so the major international pharmaceutical lobby associations, and making very strong statements that there was no need for a waiver, that existing rules were sufficiently flexible, that the problem was really one of capacity in developing countries. So really, this was a red herring. They didn't really need a waiver. And this is usually the traditional position of these countries when it comes to intellectual property rights issues at the WTO. So the challenge for developing countries at the WTO is that the WTO operates by consensus. They don't do anything by voting. Everybody has to agree. So essentially, because a small number of countries were refusing to move forward and actually negotiate this waiver, things got blocked. And this started to sort of polarize countries at the WTO. Developing countries became increasingly frustrated and angry, particularly as they saw the vaccines being developed and the first rollouts announced, knowing that they would be further left behind in their access to medical goods. So one of the tactics that we saw that developing countries used at the WTO in order to increase the pressure and try to win the case, win over developed countries to support a waiver, is they actually started to use a human rights framework. So traditionally countries would say, this is like a technical, a legal issue. We have to figure out what are the technical problems here. Instead, they started to frame it as a moral issue. They talked about the human right to health, which is actually a human right that's established under various international human rights treaties. And so we saw developed countries at the WTO use a different kind of tactic that was really based on moral claims. So they really tried essentially to reframe the debate around the waiver at the WTO as one about, countries are responsible for protecting not just the lives of their citizens, but also the citizens of other countries. And so therefore we saw kind of very animated and heated debate amongst countries where you would have developing countries, tell U.S. or Canadian or Swiss negotiators, basically don't block the waiver because by doing so, you are condemning millions of people to death. So this was a very, very heated debate at the WTO. Now, what was going on at the WTO also drew international attention because the position of the US, Canada, the EU, and Switzerland became a focal point for a global advocacy campaign to sort of to push countries to accept this waiver. So this issue, which had been kind of a technical, legal, arcane debate at the WTO, sort of became something of global attention. And all of a sudden people were talking about why the WTO is getting in the way of access to vaccines, access to medicines. And this put increasing pressure on the holdouts, on developed countries, to support the waiver. And eventually that pressure just became too much to bear. Which is why we saw the U.S. sort of change its position. Eventually the U.S., which was one of the countries blocking the waiver, changed its position to sort of become okay, well, we'll accept a waiver. We'll actually move forward with this. So really what we saw at the WTO, we saw this kind of very sort of shifting politics, which are kind of new at the WTO, where developing countries started to really focus on the human right to health. And this is sort of interesting for a scholar like me because I've been studying the WTO for 30 years and never have I seen developing countries use human rights arguments at the WTO. In fact, historically, developing countries have shied away from using human rights arguments at the WTO. That's something usually that rich countries like to do. They particularly around things like labor rights. Those have been really pushed at the WTO before. But developing countries have tended to shy away from human rights because many of them don't have great human rights records and so on. But they really thought this was a very useful way of pressuring northern countries to change position on the waiver. And so eventually what we started to see is some movement toward agreement to negotiate a waiver by sort of mid 2021. There was an agreement that they were going to move forward, and then as we started to roll toward 22, when the WTO was going to have its first ministerial meeting since the pandemic, because it hadn't met, it's supposed to meet every 2 years, ministers had not met because of the pandemic. It became increasingly obvious that the COVID-19 waiver was going to be the big prize, the big issue up for debate at the ministerial. Yeah. So what was also interesting for me as a scholar of international economy was the way that this human rights framework really sort of made the demand for the waiver, gave it a legitimacy, because as soon as it became a right to health issue, we started to see other actors mobilize around that. So the conversation sort of left the WTO. So not only did you see NGOs support the waiver, but we actually saw the head of the World Health Organization say, yeah, that's a great idea. We need a waiver. You should do this, WTO member states. We saw a lot of the UN agencies that have health mandates also come strongly on board and say, yes, this waiver, it makes total sense. Why don't we have one already? And we started to see even professional medical associations, including nurses and doctors, all sort of endorse this waiver. So it sort of became the world against Canada, the EU, and Switzerland, and Japan, right? It was basically the world against those four governments. And so even with all that pressure still going into the ministerial, they were really nobody was really sure what was going to happen with the waiver. And so going into the ministerial, what essentially happened was in the first couple of days, it didn't seem like a deal was going to happen on the waiver. There was still a lot of holdout from especially the EU, Japan, and Canada. But the Director General of the WTO, she really she put a lot of political pressure on countries to accept the waiver, basically arguing if the WTO can't come up with a waiver, the WTO will be seen as a failure, and this will erode the legitimacy and significance of this institution. So they try to make it a bigger issue than just the COVID vaccine waiver. So through those efforts, and eventually, the fact that U.S. had turned sides and started to say, well, we will support a waiver, really sort of undermined the arguments of the holdouts. And we saw sort of a last-minute rush to negotiate a waiver. So the ministerial had to be extended for an additional 4 days so states could finish negotiating. And eventually we did get a waiver. Now, was it a perfect waiver? There's been a lot of debate about that. So the waiver that was actually agreed to in June was that basically states have agreed to a waiver that will apply on the supply of vaccines. So right now it's limited just to vaccines. But the other part of it, which is on all medical goods, but also the copyrights, the patents to learn how to make the vaccines yourself, so that kind of technology that Anna was talking about, those things are still up for debate, and they're going to be debated in December. So in December, there's going to be a follow-up meeting at the WTO, and we're going to see there if we see an extended waiver which applies to all the sort of production side of waivers and other medical goods. And so I'm not a betting person, so I'm not sure if this will actually go through. But what's been interesting has been the way that at the WTO, we saw this shift in the way developing countries were approaching this issue. This idea that it was a human rights issue and actually using human rights language was a really interesting development. So it's like a flow of ideas that flow into the space, which is not really a receptive space for human rights. And we did see cooperation. We did see movement toward a waiver. So I'm somewhat optimistic, though, that we will move in a direction that can address that problem of that 13% vaccinated in developing countries. It's a sin and it's a shame, right? And so hopefully states have learned their lessons, and we will be moving toward much more equitable vaccine distribution in the future. So thank you, Len, with that.
Okay, thank you very much, all three of you. My job is now to just hand out the microphone, so I will run around as I can freely.
Maybe we can both jump on this one. Yeah. So what the waiver does basically currently is that the formula for the vaccine is no longer that countries can produce their own generic versions of the vaccine without paying the copyright to Moderna. So in theory, that should scale up accessibility in production. And if it's true that technology is so easy to transport, we should be seeing hopefully some production sites emerge in developing countries, right? Because right now I think it's only India is the only country that produces en masse, not RNA, but vaccines in general.
Oh, yeah, they're like the major
Yeah. Yeah, so we should start to see like that capacity, but if the second part of the waiver, which will ensure access to all the copyrights, the patents, and sort of basically how to build those machines, off patent and not having to buy them whatever exorbitant price that they go for, that in theory should scale up and allow these countries to more quickly respond to current and future variations of COVID going forward. But that also means these governments have to invest in building that capacity as well, and not just relying on imports.
Yeah. Do we need to make sure that we're not projecting at the same time, or does it matter?
Heather told me that they're all school inputs, so we don't need to worry about it.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, I was just making sure that we're not getting crazy feedback on Zoom. So I guess kind of building on that, I suspect that one of the reasons that waiver was even considered or passed by some of these countries is it's easier said than done, right? Like you can look up now, anybody can actually go and see like the exact chemical composition and the sequence of the RNA that's in the vaccines, like that's publicly available, but actually being able to make it is kind of more of an art form. So even when my students come to the lab, like you can read a protocol for this, but then even by doing all the steps in that protocol, not have made a successful vaccine. So you almost really need somebody to show you how to do it. And I think that's why like even the IP, like having access to someone's patent doesn't necessarily just give you the ability. It's like the know-how of actually making these things. And so I think that's probably the major limitation right now. Like there's just a few companies and a few people and teams within those companies that have made these at the scale that you would need to do. And I'm not sure how willing they are to, you know, go to another site and show, okay, here's all of our kind of trade secrets, right?
Then you receive your point, which is you got international students who are going to come and learn and
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about UBC and kind of the environment here is people in my lab are from all around the world, right? Like my PhD students came from India and Bulgaria and it's really like, yeah, it's great to just see like being able to push that technology to other countries as well. Cause I'm all for, I mean, I'm probably like kind of a hypocrite too, right? Because I have patents on these vaccines. And so that's just kind of the culture when you're like, not on any of the vaccines you guys have gotten, don't worry. But that's kind of the culture in the community, right? Like you make something new and you patent it, and then like theoretically that gives you the like opportunity to decide what to do with it. But I don't think anybody's ever really decided, at least that I've seen in the biomedical community, to just make it like openly available and kind of release their patent.
Yeah, definitely, and thanks for the question, because that was part of my flow, is like the flow of knowledge, is what I was trying to get at. American nurses set up a very Americanized curriculum, and in the US, there was a National League of Nursing Education that developed the curriculum. I forget when that was, but the schools in Iran used that same curriculum. So the curriculum was modeled on the US curriculum. It was the same curriculum that was implemented in the mission nursing schools. And also, when the Iranian government started the first 3 government nursing schools, it hired American mission nurses to start them, along with some Iranian nurses, and so the curriculum was also American-based, the same American curriculum as was used in the US. So they were using American textbooks. They were typically using English as a language, also because students often had different linguistic backgrounds, and there had to be a common language, and part of the imperialism kind of with bringing the education was language. So yeah, and then there was also all the additional extracurricular, I don't know, the pageantry and the ceremonies and such that were also American, that were spread globally actually, but yeah. Oh, that's a good question. No. So I would say maybe 1950s-ish. And then there was, at that time, the British also became involved in Iran politically with, there was a British presence in Iran, and British nurses started nursing schools. So I think that curriculum would have been probably British, and which was different than the US model. And then prior to the revolution, many Iranian nurses, as I mentioned, went to the US, so leaders that were within the government had done further education at Columbia often was the main place where they seem to have gone. and then were bringing back educational ideas, and they implemented a national curriculum in Iran, a national nursing curriculum. So that was developed by Iranians, many of who trained in the US. And then the government also, until 1979, was hiring American nurses to work in, like, the University of Mashhad or University of Tehran, for example. They were involved in education in that way also. Thank you.
Do you have any idea of, like, what is the legacy of that today? Like, what is their current curriculum like?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting question. I've, in talking to colleagues in Iran, I've been told that some places still use American nursing textbooks, but I don't know, I can't say how I don't think that would be very uniform across the country, even if there are some institutions that might use American textbooks. Interestingly, though, the stamp that I showed you that pictured these nurses kind of in the image of Nightingale, that was released on Florence Nightingale's birthday, and after the revolution, especially during the Iran-Iraq War, there was other images of nurses that emerged, but they were wearing hijab. It was a very different image. They were still very prominent nationally in national discourse, nurses, but a different image emerged. And Nurses' Day was no longer celebrated on Florence Nightingale's birthday, but on the birthday of the Prophet's granddaughter, who'd been involved in caregiving work. So they kind of reappropriated and kind of that narrative. So, yeah. Yeah, there is a lot there. I'll see what I can say. So first of all, Nightingale as an icon is a problematic icon globally, including here where my students in their textbooks, there's frequently references to Nightingale, partly because of what she did and her interest in sanitation, but also because she's become this particular icon for nursing, and nurses use her as a cultural kind of symbol. And I would argue, and what I'm arguing in my work on pageantry, is that she really is an emblem of whiteness in nursing. And I can share one vague example where I was at a conference and there was a black student. It wasn't in Canada, it was somewhere else, but a black student was dressed up as Nightingale at this conference and her face was painted white. So just to show you like how prominent that actually is in nursing, and repeatedly I've seen and experienced this in various settings. And there's a pushback against that too from a lot of nurses and scholars also. But so that's one thing. Prior to American nurses in Iran, there was a whole range of caregivers that did healing work, just as in Canada or elsewhere, including men who were involved in some caregiving or some healing types of work. There was also, Iran had a bit of a different system where there was nursing and there was midwifery. So midwifery developed a bit differently than nursing within the country. I forget what I was saying exactly along that line. But, so midwives were very prominent. I forget what I was going to say about that. But anyway, there was also, in Iran at this time, what was really fascinating, and what I didn't talk about at this is in public discourse, the government, like state politicians were claiming, for various political and other reasons, that Iran was an unhealthy nation. So they were mirroring what the missionaries were saying. So there's, I think I've showed previously, like a newspaper clip where Mother Iran is lying ill, dying. And then there was this idea that the daughters of Iran had to come and cure Mother Nation. So really, around this same time that missionary nurses were starting their schools, there was also this public discourse about women's role in the nation, which was using a medicalized language, which others have argued. So I think this facilitated the introduction of nurses into like a professional and public sphere as well, or it helped facilitate that. And then post-revolution, nursing in Iran is interesting. Like, there's a lot of challenges. Nurses are underpaid, overworked. They're often on strike, if you look at the news in Iran, and the working conditions are not very good. And I think all of this is connected partly in the way that nursing is conceived as a very gendered profession still in Iran, and kind of devalued quite a bit in relation to medicine in Iran, more so I would say than other places. And I think all of this kind of feeds into somewhat of a poor, actually, recognition of nurses within the country. I don't know if it's a brief answer, but thank you.
Yeah, sure. So, I didn't get to talk about it today, but I'm also really passionate about science communication. I think in my previous Green College seminar, I talked about all the work that I've done with social media and TikTok. So I guess the story behind that, for those of you who don't know, is I actually, and I don't know that I even shared this last time, but the reason I got started doing that, I have a TikTok channel that's dedicated to vaccine education and literacy. And I have over 250,000 followers now, and so it's not expected when I started doing it. But the reason I started doing it was because I actually randomly got a call one day from someone who said that they were from the United Nations, asking me if I was interested in joining this organization that was trying to get more scientists and clinicians on TikTok specifically. And I 100% thought it was a scam. I was like, yeah, the pandemic has been a weird time. Lots of weird things were happening, right? But it turned out to be true. So this was something it was October 2020. This was very much on the UN's radar, right? Because we were about to have vaccines that were approved, and basically nobody knew what an RNA vaccine was, right? So actually just before this, I came from teaching a science outreach workshop that I run in MSL now, and one of the things we were talking about is there is this profound gap between the pace of science and what the public knows about. And that really came to a head during the pandemic, right? Which is one of the detriments, is that if people have never heard of an RNA vaccine before and they don't know the history that, we started working on these in 1990, the first RNA vaccine clinical trial was 10 years ago now. So we have lots of long-term safety data on these RNA vaccines. there's just all these questions and hesitancy. And we generally talk about hesitancy in this very negative and shameful way, right? But I actually argue that hesitancy is a good thing, right? Like, you should question what you're putting into your body, but there just aren't enough like outlets or educational resources for people to understand them. So I think that's actually a huge part of what we need to do more of as scientists. Is you can't just be done when you publish the paper or start a company or have a product. Like, your education needs to go beyond that. However you can communicate it to the public, whether that's talking to people around you, talking to students in schools, social media. I think there's many, many different tools, but I think that's one of the main things. Like, I always tell people, like, you can make RNA vaccines, but if nobody wants to take them, then there was no point in the first place. Yeah.
There are pockets of vaccine hostility among affluent people too, including like Ashen Island and Washington. There are a lot of educated chemical people who have pretty elaborated reasons that don't sound so psychotic. And a lot of it has to do with big pharma and distrust of big pharma. I was wondering, I was so fascinated by your talk about the spider WTO that I have not seen on the news. And I didn't know that happened. And I'm kind of follow this stuff pretty. Groups around the world that have talked about that, the immorality of so many things that are patented and the commodification of everything inside, saying that there's also these other people working in science that are not governed by that. And yes, there is a fight with big pharma, but that's not the fight. To help people reorient their struggle with big pharma, as opposed to just dissuading them or trying to dissuade them of what they know is something really wrong about how the world operates around profit, and that sign that rallies people versus profit. And that gets kind of hijacked by the anti-vaccine movement.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. I think we've seen, the COVID vaccine has made very strange bedfellows of groups you think wouldn't normally get along, but I think it's a really good observation. And I guess I just have maybe like 2 quick points. So one thing I didn't mention, but maybe I should have, is one thing that the waiver does is it also increases the negotiating power of developing countries over big pharma when it comes to buying vaccines, because they can always, not only can they threaten to not respect the property rights on particular drugs, but one of the things that the waivers also allows is like for developing countries to buy import generic versions of medicines from other countries as well. So let's say if India starts to produce an RNA vaccine, for example, or Vietnam is the companies that are going to have capacity, it means like other developing countries can say to, a big pharma corporation from the US or from Europe saying, well, if you don't give us a good deal, we're just going to waive the patents and buy it from a Vietnam or something like that. So it gives them a bit of negotiating power. So there's a bit of sort of this kind of realist kind of political economy angle. But the other thing that you mentioned that is interesting to me is, and also the previous question is like, yes, there's a lot of hesitancy and misinformation out there. But I was just recently also in Argentina, where I have a lot of family. In Argentina, because of, for a combination of reasons, some political and some because of the supply gap, was, a lot of people were getting Sputnik. And nobody wanted the Sputnik. Nobody trusted the Russian vaccine. They wanted Moderna and they wanted Pfizer. So for a lot of people in developing countries, they actually want to get the name brand American or European version because I think, similar to yours, that's what is seen as the standard, and you want to get the good one. You don't want to get the bad one. So it also has this kind of cuts both ways in the sense that people in developed countries want the drugs from North America because they trust them more than drugs from maybe their own country. So there's also... Yeah. Oh, yeah, yes. My grandmother was not happy to be getting the Sputnik. She couldn't wait to get the Moderna, I'll tell you.
I think something that's really interesting about that point too is there really is just this confliction with big pharma, right? It's like you can't do it with them, you can't do it without them, right? Like BioNTech, like it's known as the Pfizer vaccine, which I think is a travesty. Like I try to always call it the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. And if you go to Germany, they just call it the BioNTech vaccine. Like to them, Pfizer was just the people that scaled it up and made it. And that's really true. Like they just needed somebody with that global distribution capacity. And it's only big pharma companies, right? So even this company that had years of experience, had done clinical trials, like they just couldn't make it for billions of people. So that's kind of the struggle, right? It's like, and ultimately you're right, like I think today, like we've chosen to have a preference towards this like capitalistic view of like money and profits over everything, but it would be interesting to think about like ways we can prioritize different things in the future.
And a lot of these
Great question. So I guess I actually like haven't heard, you know, it's generally regarded like Russian scientists are like amazing, right? It's just, I think a difficult political time there for sure, but I haven't heard any update on like their development of RNA vaccines. All I'm aware of is basically Sputnik. So that's all I've heard of from there, but it's interesting. I'm interested to look into it and hear more.
Yeah. No, yeah. So I mean, I think we're living in an age of heightened tensions around borders because of migration, the refugee crisis. We are, in a ways, seeing all these discussions also about reshoring, bringing things back in terms on the economic side with the pandemic. So in some ways, we're kind of seeing a pendulum swing back to issues that maybe in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s were really predominant in global political economic debates, and we're kind of seeing a circling back. So it definitely would be the kind of issues and topics students do want to talk about today. So there definitely is a more of an awareness of the not just how things flow across borders, but how we're actually trying to stop things, whether it's people or it's vaccine patents or it's just jobs. So it's an interesting time.
Well, I just wanted to know more about the
Well, that's a good question too. They were wearing hijab, currently, until right now with the current situation in Iran, many people are removing their mandatory hijab. So I've seen some videos of doctors and nurses and other healthcare workers outside of hospitals protesting and yelling, "Women, freedom, life freedom." So it seems like some nurses are protesting. I tried to find if there was an organized nursing statement, if the Iranian Nurses Association was had put anything out in relation to the events in Iran, but I haven't found anything yet where there's an organized professional statement about what's going on. But individual nurses are removing their hijab, but they were wearing hijab prior to the current revolution. Yeah, and they were. Also in other countries, nurses wear hijab and do their work, and it's fine. And I think, so yeah.
Because all of the pictures you have, the nurses were dressed like Western nurses.
Yes, yeah.
And that was all before the revolution.
Yeah, when 1979 happened, the revolution is very complicated, the 1979 revolution. I took a whole course in it, and we didn't come to a consensus, our graduate class, over the causes of the revolution. But when the revolution happened, many people wanted change, and they wanted the revolution, and they wanted the Shah gone. So the nurses in the clip, there's a clip on YouTube that shows that they were saying, "We fought in the revolution, we wanted it, we treated people in the hospitals." But what happened pretty soon after, when Khomeini came from France or wherever and started to impose laws, I think the first law was women judges were not allowed to practice. There were a series of laws that were put in place that restricted women's rights. And one of the things that happened was mandatory hijab. So that's what, in March of 1979, they were protesting that then. But they did have to, they had to wear hijab after.
So revolutions usually create more freedoms and not take them away.